He looked his wife in the eyes, said, "Wait for me," and left with another woman. Frederick Pembroke had a grand estate, a brilliant reputation, and the audacity to believe Sophia would still be standing in that doorway when he came back. She had spent 7 years being the wife who waited. She had spent 7 years being invisible in her own home. When he returned, the estate was thriving, the tenants were loyal, and his wife, the woman he told to wait, was simply gone. Not from the house, from the version of herself he had left behind. If you have ever been told to wait by someone who never deserved your time, subscribe to our channel and tell us, have you ever waited too long for someone who didn't deserve it? The candles in the great dining hall of Pembroke Manor had burned low by the time the last of the guests filtered out into the cold November night. Their laughter trailed down the gravel drive, swallowed by fog and darkness, and what was left behind was silence, the particular, heavy kind of silence that settles into a house when something irreversible is about to happen. Sophia Pembroke stood at the window of the upstairs library and watched the last carriage disappear through the iron gates. She did not move for a long time. The fire behind her had burned down to embers, and she had not thought to add more wood, because thinking about wood required thinking about tomorrow, and tomorrow was something she could not yet allow herself to consider. In her right hand, folded into a square so precise it looked almost deliberate, was a letter. She had found it 3 days ago, tucked inside the lining of a travel case Frederick had left open on the writing table in his study. She had gone in to retrieve a ledger, something ordinary, something domestic, and the letter had simply been there, folded on top of a silk handkerchief she did not recognize. The handwriting on the front was feminine and unhurried, the kind of penmanship taught to girls in houses considerably grander than the one she had grown up in. The ink was violet. The seal had already been broken. She had not meant to read it. She read every word. "My darling Frederick, have made arrangements for the villa in Nice. I have told the staff to expect us by the 20th. Come to me, and bring nothing that reminds you of England. I want only you, Vivi Victoria." Lady Victoria Ashford, whose family estate bordered the Pembroke land to the north, whose laugh carried across every county assembly like a bell struck too hard, whose husband had died of fever 2 years prior, and left her the kind of freedom that widowhood alone could purchase for a woman in 1818. Sophia had stood in her husband's study with that letter in her hand for a very long time. She had not cried. She had noticed with the detached clarity of someone watching themselves from a great distance that her hands were perfectly steady. The fire in Frederick's study had crackled. The clock on the mantel had ticked, and Sophia Pembroke had carefully refolded the letter, tucked it into the pocket of her day dress, and gone back to managing the household accounts as though nothing had changed. Because in a manner of speaking, nothing had. She had suspected for months. The late returns from supposed business in London. The new tailor whose bills she was not permitted to review. The way Frederick had begun looking at her, not with hostility, not with cruelty, but with the specific absence of attention that is somehow worse than either. She had been rearranging the furniture of her suspicions for long enough that seeing the letter was less a revelation than a confirmation. A door she had been standing outside of, ear pressed to the wood, finally swinging open. She had known. She simply had not known what to do with knowing. The farewell dinner had been Frederick's idea. A grand affair, he'd called it. 20 covers. The county's best families. Excellent wine. Excellent food. Frederick at the head of the table in his best coat, holding court the way he always did, brilliantly, effortlessly, the way a man holds court when he has never once doubted his right to the room. He had announced the trip as a business matter, a trade negotiation with French investors. Something about tariffs and land rights along the northern coast. He had been articulate and serious and utterly convincing, and Sophia had sat at the opposite end of the long table and watched people believe him, and she had smiled at all the right moments, and refilled no one's glass herself because that was the footman's responsibility, and she had not said a single word that was untrue. That, she supposed, was the difference between them. When Mrs. Hartwell had leaned across the table and touched her wrist. "You must be so proud of him, my dear, always working so hard for the estate," Sophia had answered. "Frederick is very dedicated," and both of those things were technically accurate. He was dedicated, simply not to the estate, and not, it had become clear to her. After the guests left, and the servants began clearing the table, and the house settled into its nighttime rhythms, Sophia had come upstairs to the library. She had taken the letter from her pocket. She had stood at the window. She had waited. She knew he would come looking for her. He always did before a departure. It was one of his habits, one of the small domestic rituals that had accumulated over 7 years of marriage: the good night in the library, the formal farewell that was somehow also affectionate, the particular way he had of touching her face when he said goodbye, that made her feel always that she was something he was reluctant to leave behind. She had loved that habit once. She had waited for it at the end of his long days. Now she stood in the library with the letter in her hand and waited for a very different reason. The door opened just before 10 o'clock. Frederick came in with a glass of brandy. His cravat loosened, his hair slightly disordered in the way it always got when he'd been talking for hours. He looked satisfied in the way a man looks when an evening has gone exactly as he intended. He looked, Sophia thought, entirely at ease. He stopped when he saw her face. Not her expression, she was certain. Her expression was composed. She had made it so deliberately, but something in her posture, or the quality of the silence around her, registered even through his contentment. The satisfaction dimmed slightly. He set the brandy glass on the side table by the door. "You're still awake. I was waiting for you." Something moved across his face. "The evening went well," I thought. Wyndham seemed particularly interested in the French proposal. It could mean a significant Frederick. He stopped. Sophia unfolded the letter. She did not hand it to him. She held it open, facing her, as though reading it for the first time, though she had long since memorized every word. "I found this in your travel case," she said, 3 days ago." The room did not change. The embers still glowed. The clock still ticked. But something shifted in Frederick Pembroke's face that Sophia had never seen there before. Not guilt, not quite, but the specific expression of a man who has been certain he was in control of a situation and has just discovered he was not. He said nothing. "Nice," Sophia said. "She has made arrangements for a villa in Nice." She folded the letter again with the same precise care she always used. "The 20th, that is 4 days after you depart." "Sophia, I am not asking you whether it is true." Her voice was level. Not cold, she had not gone cold. She had simply gone somewhere very still and clear inside herself, somewhere that could hold this conversation without shattering. "I know it is true. I am asking you something else." He crossed to the chair nearest the fire and sat down heavily, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The posture of a man preparing to explain something complicated. "It is not what it appears, is it not? Victoria and I, it is a complicated situation. There are business dimensions to this that you would not." "Frederick," she said his name the same way she always said it, quietly, without inflection. "Is this why you asked me to wait for you?" He lifted his head. "Every time you leave," Sophia said, "you tell me to wait for you. You say it like a promise, or perhaps like a command. I have never been entirely certain which." She looked at him. "Is this what I have been waiting for?" He stood up from the chair. He crossed toward her, and she did not back away. She simply held her ground, which was different from holding her ground out of defiance. She held it because the floor beneath her feet was solid, and she had decided to stand on solid things. "I made a mistake," he said. It was not planned. It became." He stopped, and she could see him choosing his words the way a man chooses which path to take through difficult terrain, looking for the one that costs him the least. "I did not intend for it to become what it became. You must believe that." "What I believe," Sophia said carefully, "is that you made a choice. You have been making this choice for some time, and tonight you sat at our table, in our home, and you told our neighbors a story that was not true, and I sat across from you and I said nothing, because I had not yet decided what I was going to say. Sophia, I have decided now." He waited, and she saw in that moment something she had not expected to see. She saw that he was afraid. Not of her anger, not of consequences, not precisely. He was afraid of what she was about to say, which meant some part of him already knew that whatever she said next could not be unsaid. "I know about her," Sophia told him. "I have known for some time." The letter simply confirmed what I already understood. She looked at him directly. "You are going to go on this trip. I cannot stop you." "I would not try." She paused. "But I want you to understand something before you leave." He reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and familiar, and she let him hold it because it cost her nothing and because she was paying very close attention to whether it felt the way it always had. It did not. "Wait for me," he said. "I will come back and we will sort this out properly. I promise you that. Just wait for me, as you always have." Sophia looked at their joined hands. She looked at his face. She looked at the letter on the side table, folded into its precise square. She said simply, "Go to France, Frederick," and she let him go. He left the following morning, before 7 o'clock. She heard the carriage from her room. She had gone to bed after their conversation, and she had lain awake until the early hours, not crying, simply lying, very still, and letting herself understand the full dimensions of the situation she was in. By the time she heard the horses on the drive, she had already made several decisions. She did not go to the window. She did not watch him leave. She had said her goodbye in the library, which had been a different kind of goodbye than the one he thought it was, and she saw no reason to perform another one for an empty room. Instead, she got up, dressed without calling her maid, went downstairs to the kitchen, startled the cook into dropping a ladle, and asked for tea and whatever bread was already made. She ate, standing at the kitchen table while cook recovered her composure, and then she asked for the estate steward to be sent to the study at 8 o'clock. Cook stared at her. "Is something the matter?" Sophia asked. "No, ma'am. Only Mr. Thatcher usually takes his morning reports directly to the master." "Mr. Pembroke is traveling," Sophia said pleasantly. "Send Mr. Thatcher to the study at 8. He came at 8, hat in hand, looking deeply uncertain. Edmund Thatcher was a man of about 50, competent and loyal and completely unprepared for what was about to happen to him. He had managed the day-to-day operations of the Pembroke estate for 11 years, and in that time had spoken to Mrs. Pembroke perhaps a dozen times. Always briefly, always on domestic matters, a repair to the East Wing, a question about the household staff. He had a fixed idea of what Mrs. Pembroke was, and that idea involved gracious smiles and flower arrangements, not ledger books. He came into the study to find Sophia at the desk, the estate accounts open before her. "Mrs. Pembroke," he bowed slightly. "I received your message. I is the master. Mr. Pembroke has departed for France this morning," Sophia said. "He will be abroad for some time. In his absence, I will be managing the estate." Thatcher stood very still. "Ma'am, please sit down, Mr. Thatcher. We have a great deal to discuss." She turned a page in the ledger. "For instance, these arrears on the tenant rents. I can see from the notation that 3 families in the South Field have been in arrears for over 8 months. What is the current situation with them?" Thatcher sat down slowly, as though the chair might object. The arrears? Yes, ma'am. It's been a difficult harvest the last 2 years particularly." Mr. Pembroke was he had indicated he would address the matter when he returned from. "He has indicated that for 8 months?" A pause. "There were other pressing concerns." "I am certain there were." Sophia looked up from the ledger. "Mr. Thatcher, I am going to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me, which I understand may feel unusual, given that you are accustomed to managing the estate with considerable autonomy. I am not criticizing that. I am simply asking you to tell me the truth about what you know." He looked at her with the expression of a man who is recalibrating everything he thought he understood about a situation. "How bam?" A long silence. "Fairly bad," he said finally. "Show me." It was worse than fairly bad. Over the following 3 hours, Edmund Thatcher showed Sophia Pembroke what the estate actually looked like underneath the polished social surface. Frederick had been maintaining the dinners, the county assemblies, the grand farewell party with 20 covers and excellent wine. What lay beneath was a different picture entirely. 3 tenant farms in arrears, 2 more where the drainage had failed and the crops had been under water for the last planting. A dispute with the neighboring Ashford land, and here Sophia noted the irony without remarking on it, over a shared boundary that had been left unresolved for 2 years. A debt to a London merchant house, substantial, carrying interest, that Frederick had apparently been servicing in a way that involved borrowing against the 8's future revenues. She sat with all of it, and she did not let herself become overwhelmed by it, and she did not let Thatcher see that he was anything other than entirely in control of the situation. "All right," she said when he had finished. "Ma'am, we will begin with the tenants." She closed the first ledger and opened the second. "I want to visit the farms this week, starting with the families in the most difficult circumstances. I want to understand exactly what they need, not what has been assumed they need." Thatcher stared at her. "Visit the farms yourself, ma'am? Is there a reason I should not?" He opened his mouth, and then, clearly thinking better of whatever he'd been about to say, closed it again. "No, ma'am. Good. Then we will go on Thursday." She made a note. "In the meantime, I want a full accounting of the London debt, the original terms, the current interest, what has been paid and when." I want the survey maps for the boundary dispute with the Ashford property. And I want a list of every repair that has been deferred on this estate in the last 2 years, with an estimate of cost. Thatcher was writing all of this down with the focused attention of a man who has discovered, somewhat to his shock, that he is taking orders from someone competent. Mrs. Pembroke, he hesitated. This I want to say, Mr. Pembroke has always been very particular about. Mr. Pembroke, Sophia said, pleasant France. She turned the next page. And I am here, so let us continue. The servants noticed within 48 hours. Not because Sophia made any announcement or demanded any acknowledgement of the shift in authority. She simply began being present in places she had not previously been present, asking questions she had not previously asked, making decisions that had previously been deferred to Frederick or left to accumulate. The household adjusted around her the way water adjusts around a stone, not with drama, simply with the pragmatic intelligence of people who understand that the current has changed direction and there is no particular advantage in fighting it. Mrs. Webb, the housekeeper, was the first to come around. She was a formidable woman of 60, with opinions about everything, and the kind of institutional authority that comes from having managed a large house through multiple generations of its owners. She had liked Sophia, in an abstract way, as one might like a well-chosen piece of furniture, appropriate, attractive, not troublesome. She began to respect her on Thursday, when Sophia came back from the tenant farms covered in mud to the hem of her dress, asked for tea and a basin of water, and spent the next 2 hours writing detailed notes about what she had seen. The Hollis family, Sophia said, not looking up from her writing. 3 children, the youngest still nursing. The roof of the main house has a section that will not survive another winter. I want a carpenter sent out by next week, not when it is convenient, next week. Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Webb said, and something in her voice had changed. The county noticed within the month. It was Mrs. Hartwell who first mentioned it at the Wyndham Assembly. The casual observation that Pembroke Manor seemed to be running rather smoothly in Frederick's absence, rather more smoothly than one might have expected. Mrs. Wyndham agreed, and added that she had heard from her own tenants' wives that Mrs. Pembroke had been riding out to the farms personally, which was, well, it was unusual, certainly, but the Hollis roof had been a concern to everyone who'd driven past it for years. By December, the conversation had shifted from unusual to impressive, which in the social vocabulary of rural England in 1818 was a significant distance. But Sophia was not paying attention to the county's opinion. She was paying attention to the drainage maps for the flooded fields, which Thatcher had finally located in the estate's records, and to the calculations she was running about whether the London debt could be restructured if the Eastfield grain harvest exceeded certain yields. She was paying attention to Agnes Hollis, who had started bringing her baby to the village assembly and sitting straighter than she had in years, now that the roof over her family's head was solid. She was paying attention to the young carpenter boy who had been taken on as an estate laborer and who turned out to have a gift for figures that was being wasted on fencing posts. And she was thinking about what to do about that. She received 1 letter from Frederick in the first month. It was from Paris, not nice, she noted, and it was brief and formal, and told her the negotiations were progressing well, and he hoped she was keeping well. It mentioned nothing she had said in the library. It mentioned nothing at all of substance. It was the letter of a man who had left a situation unresolved, and has decided that leaving it unresolved is the same as resolving it in his favor. She read it once. She wrote back a brief factual account of estate matters. She mentioned the Hollis roof. She mentioned the London debt restructuring she was pursuing. She did not mention Victoria Ashford. She did not mention the conversation in the library. She signed it, as she always had, your wife, Sophia, and she sent it, and then she went back to work. The second letter came 6 weeks later. She could tell from the handwriting that something was different. Frederick's handwriting was ordinarily precise and confident, the handwriting of a man who has always known what he wanted to say and how to say it. This letter was slightly uneven. The lines ran not quite straight. He was still in Paris. He mentioned the negotiations in a single sentence that clearly meant nothing. He asked, in a way that managed to be both casual and urgent, how she was finding things at Pembroke. He asked whether she had spoken to Thatcher about the boundary survey. He asked whether she was managing all right. Sophia read this letter twice. Then she set it on the desk and looked at it for a while. She wrote back, The boundary survey has been completed. We are pursuing arbitration. The East Field showed improved drainage after the work completed last month. I am managing very well, thank you for asking. She did not say, I know something has gone wrong in France. She did not say, I told you, didn't I? In the library. Before you left, I stood there and I knew, and you took my hand and asked me to wait. And I wonder now whether you ever understood what you were asking me to wait for. She sent the letter. She went back to work. By February, she had negotiated a payment structure on the London debt that gave the estate 2 years of breathing room. By March, the boundary dispute had been resolved in Pembroke's favor through arbitration. Sophia had managed this so quietly and effectively that even Thatcher hadn't fully understood what she was doing until it was already done. By April, 3 tenant families who had been on the edge of leaving the estate had signed new lease agreements, longer term, better structured, because Sophia had sat down with them individually and asked what they actually needed. You're changing things, Thatcher said one morning. He didn't say it accusingly, he said it with the air of a man observing something he hadn't expected and is still processing. Yes, Sophia agreed. Mr. Pembroke will when he returns. When he returns, he will find a well-run estate. She looked up. That is what he would have wanted, is it not? The estate to prosper? Thatcher looked at her steadily. He would, yes. Then we are doing what he would have wanted. A pause. Among other things, she did not elaborate. Thatcher did not ask. April turned into May. The weather shifted toward warmth. The fields were greening. Agnes Hollis's baby, who turned out to be a girl named for her grandmother, was thriving. The carpenter boy James, his name was James, had been moved from fencing posts to keeping the estate's secondary accounts under Thatcher's supervision, and he was learning faster than anyone had expected. Sophia rode out one afternoon in early May to the North Field, which had the best view of the estate from its upper edge, the manor in the middle distance, the village below, the long lines of the fields fanning out around it. She stood at that edge for a while and looked at all of it. 7 years she had lived here. 7 years of being Frederick Pembroke's wife, which meant managing the household beautifully and appearing at his side graciously and never quite being invited into the actual substance of things, the land, the decisions, the real work. 7 years of being the person who waited in the library while he went out into the world. She thought about the last thing he had said before he left. Wait for me. She thought about what she had been waiting for all those years. And she thought about what she was doing now, standing on this hill in early May with mud on her riding boots and a head full of drainage calculations and tenant lease structures and the particular sound of Agnes Hollis's baby daughter laughing. She thought, I am not waiting anymore. She thought, I am not sure I know how. And then she turned her horse back toward the manor, because there was work to do, and the work was hers, and she had decided somewhere between the library and this hilltop, somewhere in the space of all these months, that she was going to be very, very good at it. The letter that arrived in the second week of May was different from all the others. Frederick's handwriting was careful again, too careful. The way handwriting gets when someone is working very hard to make it look normal. The letter began with the estate matters, the accounts, the boundary arbitration. He thanked her for managing it, in language that was slightly formal, slightly careful. And then, at the bottom of the second page, in a paragraph that was shorter than the ones before it, I find myself uncertain of late, about certain things I was previously quite certain of. I do not know how to explain this more fully in a letter. I think perhaps we should speak when I return. I think there are things I owe you that I have not yet paid. Sophia read this paragraph 3 times. She thought about Frederick in France somewhere, wherever he was, in whatever room this letter had been written, in writing those words. She thought about what it would cost him to write them. Frederick, who had always been so certain, who had always moved through the world with the assurance of a man who had never once seriously doubted his own judgment. She thought about what she felt reading them. She expected to feel something clean and satisfying, the way she imagined it would feel when a man finally admitted he was wrong. She had waited long enough for the admission. What she felt instead was something more complicated, something that had to do with the distance between what she had needed from him 3 months ago and what she needed now. Those two things were not the same. She was not the same person who had stood in the library holding the letter with completely steady hands. She had not broken, she had become. And the woman she had become was not sure. sitting with this letter in the study at Pembroke Manor on a warm May morning with the accounts balanced and the fields green and all of this hers. Now, in a way it had never been, when it was only hers by marriage, she was not sure that woman fit in the space that had been left for her. She folded the letter. She sat for a very long time. Then she took out paper and ink, and she wrote back. And she was honest. And she was careful. And she was precise the way she always was, and she said what needed to be said, and she did not say what did not. And then she rang for Thatcher, because there were things to be done, and she was the person who was going to do them. Outside, the May light fell warm and even across the north field. The Hollis baby was laughing somewhere in the village. James Carpenter was bent over an account book, learning to see the shape of things. And Pembroke Manor, which had been crumbling quietly under the weight of a man's inattention, was breathing. The woman who had made it breathe sat at the desk her husband had left behind and worked, and did not wait, and did not look toward the gate. She had learned something, in all these months, that she had not expected to learn. She had learned that the hardest thing was not the betrayal. The hardest thing was discovering on the other side of it that you were someone you had not previously had the chance to be, and that you were not at all sure you wanted to give her up. The letter she had written back to Frederick sat in the post for 11 days before she stopped thinking about it. Not because she had resolved anything, not because the words she had chosen had satisfied her, but because the Eastfield Drainage Survey had revealed a secondary problem with the irrigation channel that fed 3 separate tenant plots, and the solution required her full attention for the better part of 2 weeks. And when your full attention is required elsewhere, the things you have sent away in envelopes have a way of receding to a manageable distance. This, Sophia was discovering, was one of the more useful properties of work. Thatcher brought her the irrigation report on a Tuesday morning, spreading the survey maps across the study desk with the careful precision of a man who had started to understand that Mrs. Pembroke would look at every detail and ask about any discrepancy. 8 months ago, he would have summarized the problem and offered a single recommended solution. Now he brought the maps, the cost estimates, and 3 possible approaches, because she had made clear quietly, without drama, that she wanted to understand the actual problem before accepting anyone else's solution to it. The channel is 23 years old, he said, tracing the line with one finger. It was well built, but the original engineering assumed a certain flow from the upper spring, and the spring output has changed over the past decade. We've been compensating each year by opening the secondary gate earlier in the season, but it's not a long-term answer. What is the long-term answer? There are 2 real options. He pointed to the first set of figures. We reroute a section of the channel expensive, probably £200, but it solves the problem permanently. Or we install a supplemental pump at the lower junction, which costs less now but requires ongoing maintenance. Sophia studied the maps. She had learned to read survey maps in the past 3 months, not because anyone had taught her, but because she had needed to understand them, and so she had sat with them until they made sense, the same way she had sat with the account ledgers and the legal documents for the boundary arbitration. It had not been comfortable. It had at times given her a headache that lasted 2 days. But she had done it. What would Frederick have done, she asked. Thatcher was quiet for a moment. He would have chosen the pump, he said finally. Lower immediate cost, and in 5 years, we'd be back here with the same problem and a failing pump on top of it. Sophia straightened up from the maps. Reroute the channel. Thatcher wrote it down without argument. That, too, had changed. She was almost out the door before he spoke again. Mrs. Pembroke, she turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something between professional regard and something more personal. The look of a man who has revised his understanding of a situation considerably and is still adjusting. I want to say what you've done here these past months. The boundary settlement, the tenant agreements, the debt restructuring. I have been managing this estate for 11 years, a pause. I did not know it was in this much trouble. I know, Sophia said quietly. I should have pushed harder, for answers, for attention. He shook his head. I deferred too readily. You deferred to the person whose name was on the deed. She held his gaze steadily. That is not the same as failing. No, he folded the survey map. But it is not the same as succeeding either. She left him with that, because there was nothing comfortable to add. And because she had found, in these months, that the most useful conversations were the ones that ended with the truth still hanging in the air, unsweetened. Outside in the corridor, she stopped for just a moment and pressed one hand briefly against the wall. Not for support, just to feel something solid. £200 for the channel reroute. She had the money. Not easily, not without careful management of the next quarter's revenues, but she had it because she had restructured the London debt, because she had brought the tenant rents current, in a way that was sustainable rather than simply collected, because she had spent 3 months learning what the estate actually was, instead of what it appeared to be. She thought briefly of Frederick. She thought of him receiving her last letter, the careful, precise, honest one, and she wondered what he had made of it. What he had made of the fact that she had written to him about irrigation surveys and tenant lease renewals and a boundary arbitration, one without drama. All the substance of the life he had left behind, and had said nothing at all about whether she missed him. She had not said it because she was not sure it was true. And Sophia Pembroke had decided, somewhere in the middle of all of this, that she was not going to say things she wasn't sure were true. Not anymore. She went to oversee the carpenter's work on the Hollis roof, because they were starting the final section that day, and she wanted to see it finished with her own eyes. Agnes Hollis met her at the farm gate. The baby on her hip, Mary, they had named her, after Agnes's own mother, and the expression on Agnes's face when she saw Sophia coming was something that Sophia tucked quietly away inside her, in the place where she kept things that mattered. "It'll hold now," Agnes said, looking up at the completed roof. "Through anything, yes," Sophia agreed, "it will." Grabbed a fistful of Sophia's riding coat and held on, the way babies do, without strategy or hesitation, simply reaching for what was there. Sophia let her hold on for a while. The county had begun to talk. She was aware of this in the peripheral way. You become aware of things that are happening around you when your full attention is elsewhere. Fragments of conversation at the village shops. The particular quality of attention she received at the monthly meeting of the parish committee. The way the wives of neighboring landowners looked at her now with an expression that was part curiosity and part something she could only describe as reassessment. Mrs. Hartwell found her in the dry goods shop in the village on a Thursday afternoon and greeted her with the specifically theatrical warmth that signals a conversation has been prepared in advance. "My dear Sophia, you are looking remarkably well." A pause designed to communicate both admiration and inquiry. "We have all been hearing such interesting things about what you've been doing at Pembroke. Your husband must be so pleased." "I hope he will be," Sophia answered pleasantly. "It is quite remarkable, a woman managing a country estate of that size entirely on her own." "I have excellent help," Sophia said. "Mr. Thatcher is extraordinarily capable." "Yes, but one hears," Mrs. Hartwell lowered her voice slightly, though the shop was nearly empty. "One hears that you have been the driving force. The tenant agreements, the debt settlement, all of it. They say you rode out to the farms yourself, in the rain, in February." "The Hollis roof was urgent in February," Sophia said. "Rain made it more urgent, not less." Mrs. Hartwell stared at her, and then she laughed a genuine laugh, not the social variety, startled out of her. "You know," she said, "I have known you for 7 years, and I don't think I knew you at all." Sophia picked up a paper of needles and examined them with attention. "No," she agreed, "I don't think you did. It was not unkindly said. It was simply accurate, and she was practicing being accurate." What she did not tell Mrs. Hartwell was that she was not entirely sure she had known herself either. That was the part of this she had not expected, not the practical revelations, not the discovery that the estate was mismanaged, not even the discovery that she was competent to fix it. The unexpected thing was the self that had emerged from the work. Not built exactly, more like excavated, as though the woman she was capable of being had been present all along, under the careful layers of being Frederick Pembroke's wife, and it had simply taken his absence to give her room to come to the surface. She did not know entirely what to do with that woman yet, but she was becoming very interested in finding out. The second week of June brought 2 things: a letter from Frederick that was longer than any previous one, and a visit from a man she had not met before. The letter arrived first. She had been at the desk in the study when Webb brought it in, and something about the weight of it thicker than usual, the handwriting on the envelope slightly compressed, as though a great deal had been forced into a small space, made her set down her pen and simply hold it for a moment before opening it. Frederick wrote from Paris. He had been there for almost 3 weeks now, longer than the original journey had been intended to last, and he did not explain why. He wrote about the city, the architecture, the light, a concert he had attended, Small observations that were clearly not the real content of the letter, clearly the scaffolding around something else. And then, on the third page, the scaffolding fell away. I have been trying to write this for 2 weeks. I have started and abandoned it a dozen times. I find that I am not as certain as I was about a great many things, but most particularly about what I left behind when I left England. When I left you, I have been thinking about the library, about what you said. You said it was a choice, and I told you it was more complicated than that, because I wanted it to be more complicated, because complicated meant I had less culpability than a simple choice would imply. But you were right, it was a choice. I made it, and I am not certain I knew, when I made it, what I was choosing between. I am beginning to understand now. I think understanding for me has come rather late and rather expensively. I do not know what I am asking. I think I am only telling you that I am sorry, not as a means to an end. I am simply sorry, and I did not know how to be simply sorry before, so I am practicing. Sophia read the letter twice. Then she set it down very carefully, as though it was something that needed gentle handling. She sat for a long time without moving. She thought about the version of herself who had stood in the library holding Victoria Ashford's letter, hands perfectly steady, deciding what kind of woman she was going to be. She thought about what that woman had needed from Frederick in that moment. He could not have given her what she needed then. She understood that now. Not because he was incapable, she was beginning to think he was not as incapable as she had believed. Or perhaps had hoped because incapable was simpler, but because he had not yet understood that he needed to try. The understanding had to come first. The understanding apparently cost something. She could see the cost in the uneven quality of the letter, in the compressed handwriting, in the 3 pages of scaffolding before he could get to the truth. She did not know yet what she felt about the truth, now that she had it. She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the others. She would answer it, but not yet. She needed to sit with it for a while, the way she sat with the survey maps long enough to actually understand what she was looking at before she decided what to do. The visitor arrived that same afternoon. His name was Mr. Charles Whitmore, and he had come from London. He was a solicitor, not Frederick's solicitor, whose name she knew, and he had a card and a letter of introduction from a firm she had not heard of, and he asked for Frederick by name and was visibly nonplussed to discover that Frederick was abroad, and that his wife was receiving the firm's clients in his place. It is a matter of some sensitivity, Whitmore said carefully. He was a precise man in his mid-40s, well-dressed, professional in the way of a man who has navigated a great many awkward situations and has developed a reliable method for each one. I was specifically asked to speak with Mr. Pembroke directly. Mr. Pembroke is in France, Sophia said, in the pleasant, level tone she had developed for conversations that were trying her patience. I am managing the estate in his absence. If the matter pertains to Pembroke estate concerns, I am the appropriate person to speak with. He hesitated. She waited. It does pertain to the estate, he said finally. Indirectly, then please tell me. Another hesitation, briefer. He was recalibrating. She could see it the same process she had watched Thatcher go through, and Cook, and Mrs. Hartwell, and every other person who had arrived with a fixed idea of what they would find, and had instead found her. There is a matter of debt guarantee, he said. Several months ago, Mr. Pembroke signed a personal guarantee against credit instrument held by a Parisian investment house. The instrument has encountered difficulties. The guarantee has been called. Sophia kept her expression exactly where it was. How much? He named a figure. The figure was significant. Not catastrophic, not if managed carefully, not if she moved quickly, but significant. And it had not appeared anywhere in the accounts she had reviewed, which meant Frederick had signed this guarantee privately, separately, without recording it in the estate accounts, which meant he had not wanted her to see it, which meant it was almost certainly connected to the French trip. The scaffolding around this particular truth was not very complicated at all. She breathed once, slowly, and let the anger move through her, without letting it land on Whitmore, who was only the messenger, and who was, she could see, already uncomfortable with his errand. Then she said, I will need the full documentation. The original instrument, the guarantee terms, the calling notice, all of it. Of course, Mrs. Pembroke. When is the response required? 30 days from the date of the notice. He paused. Which was issued 10 days ago. 20 days. Leave the documents with my housekeeper, she said. I will be in touch with your firm by the end of the week. When he was gone, she sat in the study for exactly 5 minutes, without moving or speaking. Mrs. Webb, who had an uncanny instinct for when she was needed, appeared at the door with tea she had not been asked for. Sophia looked at the tea. She looked at Mrs. Webb's careful, watchful face. "I need to send a letter to Frederick," Sophia said. "Today?" "Yes, ma'am." Webb set down the tray. "Shall I bring paper?" "Please." The letter she wrote to Frederick that afternoon was the least careful letter she had ever sent him. It was direct, it was specific, it named the figure, named the debt instrument, named the guarantee he had signed and not disclosed, and it asked in language that was not quite cold, but was no longer warm, for a complete and immediate accounting of his financial activities in France, because she was the one managing his estate, and she could not manage it on the basis of incomplete information. She did not address the question of why he had signed a guarantee privately. She did not have to. They both knew the answer. The letter went express post that afternoon. She heard back in 9 days, which was faster than she expected, which told her that her letter had landed the way it was intended to land. Frederick's response was 2 pages. The first page was explanation, or what passed for explanation, which was a fairly comprehensive account of an investment venture he had entered into with a Parisian firm at Victoria Ashford's introduction, which had seemed at the time like a sound opportunity, and had proved in the months since to be neither sound nor an opportunity. The second page was the accounting she had requested, complete, detailed, and she could see from the figures that the guarantee was the largest single liability, but was not the only one. There were others, smaller, that together added a material amount to the total. She did not throw the letter across the room. She had passed the stage of wanting to throw things. She set it next to the irrigation cost estimate and the channel reroute budget and the tenant lease renewal schedule, and she looked at all of it together, all the landscape of what she was managing, what she had built, and what had been handed to her in pieces, and she felt not defeat, not even anger, not precisely. Something more like the particular clarity that comes when you have been suspecting the full size of a problem and have now been shown it directly and can at last see its actual edges. This was the size of it. This was what she was working with. All right. She called Thatcher. She called the estate's London solicitor, Frederick's solicitor, whose name she did know, who had dealt with Frederick for 20 years, and who received her summons with the barely concealed surprise of a man who has never been summoned by a wife before. She had all of them in the study at 9 o'clock the following morning. She had been up since 5, working through the numbers. When Thatcher arrived and saw the papers spread across the desk and the look on her face, he stopped in the doorway. "How bad is it? Significant? Manageable?" She held his gaze. "I need you to tell me honestly, how is the estate's income position if we have a strong harvest this year? Strong if the east fields come in well. We've done the drainage work," so he did a rapid mental calculation. She could see it in his face. Better than last year. Considerably better. And if we take the channel reroute work from the capital reserve rather than current revenue, does that change our quarterly position? Another calculation. It tightens it, but it doesn't break it. Good. She turned to the solicitor, who was looking at the papers with an expression caught somewhere between professional concern and something more reluctant, the expression of a man who has just realized the woman across the desk from him is considerably more capable than the situation he prepared himself for. "I need to understand the terms of the original guarantee in full, and I need to know our option conducting the calling notice. Start with the timing of the original signature. They worked for 4 hours without stopping. By the time the solicitor left, the outline of a response to the calling notice was drafted. It was not a simple response. Nothing about this was simple, but it was a defensible one, constructed around a technical question about the notice timing that the solicitor had identified, somewhat to his own surprise, as a genuine legal issue. It would buy time. Time was what she needed. What she needed after the solicitor left was to sit very quietly for a few minutes and not talk to anyone. Thatcher, who had remained after the solicitor's departure to help her reorganize the papers, watched her sit quietly, and correctly identified that now was not the time to say anything. He gathered the papers neatly, set them in order, and was almost at the door when she spoke. "Do you know what is the strangest part of all this?" He turned. "I am not angry at the situation," she said. "I am not even particularly surprised." She looked at the organized papers on the desk. "I am angry that he did not tell me. Not about Victoria. I had made my peace with the shape of that. I am angry about this." She touched the letter with 2 fingers. "The money, the guarantee. The fact that he was conducting this entire secondary life, financial, personal, all of it, and the assumption, apparently, was that none of it would ever become my problem, because I would simply be here waiting, and things would sort themselves out. Thatcher said nothing. He was listening. He didn't hide it from me because he thought I couldn't handle it, she said slowly, working it out as she spoke. He hid it from me because he had genuinely not considered that it would ever reach me. He simply did not account for the possibility that his choices had consequences that extended to me. A pause. That is somehow worse than if he had calculated it. Yes, Thatcher said quietly. I think it is. She picked up the letter, folded it, added it to the drawer. Go home, Mr. Thatcher. You have been here since 9 o'clock. So have you? Yes, she almost smiled, but I live here. After he left, she sat at the desk until the light through the windows shifted from the flat brightness of afternoon into something warmer and lower. The particular quality of early evening in June when the days are longest and the dark seems reluctant to come. She thought about writing to Frederick again. She had things to say, the legal response, the financial details, the things he needed to know about the position his choices had put the estate in. She thought about the letter he had sent before Whitmore arrived. I am simply sorry, and I did not know how to be simply sorry before, so I am practicing. She thought about what that had cost him to write Frederick, who was never simply anything, who had always dressed every feeling in purpose and strategy. She thought about the distance between the man who had stood in the library and told her to wait for him and the man who was writing letters like that from Paris. She wondered how far apart those two men actually were. She wondered whether the distance mattered. She did not have an answer. She had stopped expecting herself to have answers to all the questions yet. What she had was the estate, and the work, and the growing weight of a year that had taken her apart in certain fundamental ways and put her back together in a different configuration. She had Agnes Hollis's baby, who had grabbed her coat and held on. She had Thatcher's transformed regard, and Mrs. Webb's, and the slowly shifting opinion of a county that had written her off as a fixture and was now watching her with something that felt, unexpectedly, like respect. She had herself. That was the thing she had not expected to find at the end of all this. Not the estate, not the work, not the social position or the practical competence. Herself, the woman she was when no one was asking her to wait. She sat with that for a while. Then she pulled out paper, dipped her pen, and began to write, not to Frederick, not yet, but the draft of a proposal she had been developing for 3 weeks now, quietly, separately from all the crisis management and financial navigation. A proposal for a small school, for the tenant children in the South Village, who had no access to education and whose parents, several of whom she had now spoken with at length, wanted better for them, with the specific, clear-eyed want of people who understand exactly what they are missing. The Pembroke estate had a vacant outbuilding that had been used for storage for 20 years and was structurally sound and entirely wasted. She had a carpenter who could renovate it. She had a connection through the parish committee to a school teacher in the next county who was looking for a position. She was calculating the funds to sustain it for the first year if she was careful about the sequencing. She had not told anyone yet, not Thatcher, not Mrs. Webb, not anyone. It felt important somehow to have something that was entirely hers, not a response to crisis, not management of someone else's disaster. Something she had conceived and was building, because she believed it was the right thing, and because she had decided, standing on the Northfield hilltop 2 months ago, looking at everything that was hers to tend, that tending it well meant more than keeping it solvent. It meant making it worth something. She wrote until the candle burned low, then lit another and kept writing. Outside, the June night settled over Pembroke Manor, with the unhurried certainty of summer, and the fields were green, and the Hollis roof held fast, and the woman in the study was building something that had no name yet, that she could not fully explain, that had started in humiliation and grief, and a letter folded into a precise square, and had become somehow, in the months of work and early mornings and honest conversations and maps and ledgers, and one baby named Mary, who grabbed what she needed without strategy. It had become a life, hers, and she was only beginning to understand what she intended to do with it. The school proposal was approved by the parish committee. On a Thursday morning in late June, which was the same morning Frederick's next letter arrived, which was the same morning Sophia decided, with the particular certainty of a woman who has stopped waiting for permission, that she would break ground on the outbuilding renovation by the end of the month. 3 things at once. She was learning to hold 3 things at once. The parish committee had been skeptical in the specific way that institutions are skeptical of ideas that have not been tried before, not hostile, simply cautious. Their caution dressed up in practical questions about funding and sustainability, and whether the tenant families would actually participate. Sophia had answered every question with prepared specifics. Funding, the first year was underwritten by estate reserves. She had personally identified and allocated. Sustainability, she had letters from 4 tenant families already confirming interest. Participation, she had spoken with the families herself, in their homes, over the course of the past month, and she could report that the problem was not whether they would participate, but whether the building would be large enough. The committee had approved it. The chairman, a man named Colonel Westbrook, who had been on the committee for 30 years and had never once been surprised by a proposal from a woman, looked at her afterward with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that look of revised expectations, of a fixed idea quietly dismantled, and said, "Mrs. Pembroke, I must say, you are not what I anticipated." She agreed pleasantly. "I rarely am these days." She was in the carriage back to the estate, reading Frederick's letter against the movement of the road, when the full weight of what the letter contained settled over her. He was coming home. Not immediately. He named a date in late August, 6 weeks away, but the date was specific, which was different from the vague forward references in his previous letters. Something had shifted. Something had been decided. And reading the letter carefully, she could see the shape of what it was. Victoria Ashford had left France. Frederick did not say this directly. He never said anything directly in letters. She had observed. Even when he was trying to be honest, there was always a layer of careful language between him and the plain fact. But reading between the lines of what he wrote about the French investment venture and the collapse of certain arrangements, and his decision to wind down his Paris commitments, the shape was unmistakable. Whatever had existed between Frederick and Victoria in France had ended. The investment venture, the one into which Victoria had introduced him, the one whose debt guarantee had become Sophia's crisis to manage, had failed, and in the failure something else had apparently failed alongside it. She folded the letter and looked out the carriage window at the passing fields, and felt a complicated mixture of things that she did not try to simplify. There was no satisfaction in it, which surprised her. She had expected, somewhere in the back of her mind, that the news of Victoria's departure would produce something clean and vindicating. Instead, what she felt was something more like sorrow, not for herself, not quite, but for the whole shape of it, for the waste of it, for the specific sadness of watching a person discover, at great expense, something that could have been understood without the expense if they had only been paying attention to the right things. She had spent 7 years paying attention to Frederick. She had watched him closely, the way women watch the men they love when they are not certain they are fully seen in return, carefully, quietly, cataloging. She had known he was capable of this. She had simply not let herself know that she knew. The carriage pulled through the Pembroke gates, and she stepped down and went directly to the study, because there were 3 things her desk that needed attention before the afternoon was over. And Frederick's homecoming was 6 weeks away, which was enough time to think, and right now she needed to work. Thatcher found her an hour later, bent over the outbuilding renovation estimates. He had a look she was starting to associate with news that required management. "What is it?" she asked, without looking up. "We've had a letter from the Ashford estate solicitors," he said, "regarding the boundary." She looked up. The boundary dispute she had resolved in the spring through arbitration, the matter she had settled, cleanly and permanently, the matter she had considered finished. "We settled that, we did." He set the letter on the desk. "This is a new matter, or rather an old matter, dressed up as a new one. The Ashford solicitors are claiming that a section of the northern fence line, which the arbitration did not specifically address, encroaches on Ashford land by approximately 40 yards. Sophia stared at the letter. She read it through once, quickly. "This boundary was surveyed in the spring," she said. "The 40-yard section they're describing falls well within the area covered by the original survey. Yes, this is harassment." She set the letter down. "Someone is attempting to reopen a settled matter through technical confusion." Thatcher said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "Who is managing the Ashford estate?" she asked. "Lady Ashford's is in France. Who is managing it in her absence?" "Her solicitors have a local agent. A man named Griggs." A pause. "He arrived in the county 3 weeks ago. He has been asking questions about the estate, about you." Sophia was quiet for a moment. What kind of questions? Questions about how decisions are being made. Whether Mr. Pembroke is expected to return. Whether Thatcher stopped. He chose his next words with visible care. Whether the estate's current management is legally authorized. There it was. She had wondered when this would happen. Not whether when. A woman managing a significant country estate in her husband's absence, making major financial and legal decisions, signing contracts and negotiating debt settlements, and filing arbitration claims she had understood from the beginning. That someone would eventually decide to question it. She had simply hoped to have more time before they did. 6 weeks before Frederick came home, that was what she had. She stood up from the desk. "Get me the estate's legal charter," she said, "and the marriage settlement documents, and every contract I have signed in the past 8 months, all of them, in order, with dates." Thatcher moved fast. He was learning her rhythms. "Also," she added, "find out everything you can about Griggs. Who he actually works for, who is paying him, and what the Ashford estate's actual financial position is right now. If someone is spending solicitors' fees on a harassment campaign, they have a reason." He was already out the door. She stood at the desk for a moment after he left, her hands flat on the surface of it, and she let herself feel the anger fully, just for a moment. The way you let yourself feel the heat of something before you decide how to handle it. Then she breathed once, and picked up her pen, and began making notes. The marriage settlement, when Thatcher brought it, was exactly what she had hoped it would be: precise, comprehensive, and drafted by a solicitor who had clearly anticipated contingencies. The language regarding estate management in the husband's absence was unambiguous. She was not acting in a legal gray area. She was acting within the full scope of what the marriage settlement authorized. She wrote to the Ashford solicitors that same evening. The letter was brief, specific, and attached a copy of the relevant section of the marriage settlement along with the survey documentation from the spring arbitration. It concluded, "Any further correspondence on this matter should be directed to our estate solicitor, whose details are enclosed. Please note that the northern fence line is not subject to any further dispute, and any claim to the contrary will be treated as an attempt to relitigate a settled arbitration finding." She signed it herself. Sophia Pembroke, not the estate solicitor, not Thatcher. Herself. It went out the next morning. She did not hear from the Ashford solicitors again. What she heard, 2 weeks later, from Mrs. Hartwell, who was, Sophia had come to understand, the most efficient information network in the county, was that the Ashford estate's local agent had quietly packed up and left, and that the Ashford solicitors in London had been instructed to suspend all active matters pending Lady Ashford's return from the continent, and that Lady Ashford's return from the continent was itself the subject of considerable uncertainty, because various parties in France were apparently in no great hurry to facilitate it. "There is a great deal of speculation," Mrs. Hartwell said, with the contained excitement of someone who has excellent information and intends to deploy it carefully, about Lady Ashford's situation in Paris. "I would not normally repeat such things, but given the particular relevance to your own—" She paused delicately. "You may tell me," Sophia said. "I would rather know." "It is said that she attached herself to a French nobleman, the Comte de Villiers, very wealthy, very titled, very unwilling, as it turns out, to follow through on certain implied commitments." Mrs. Hartwell's voice was precisely balanced between sympathy and satisfaction. "She is, from what one hears, in a rather difficult social position." Sophia listened to this without expression. "And Mr. Pembroke?" she asked quietly, a pause. "It is said that the association ended some time ago, apparently rather badly. For both parties." Mrs. Hartwell looked at her with something that had moved past curiosity into something more genuine. "My dear, I am sorry, I know this cannot be. Thank you for telling me," Sophia said. "I would rather know the shape of things." She went home and she sat in the study, and she thought about Frederick somewhere in Paris, in whatever room he was occupying, in whatever state of mind followed the particular experience of discovering that the person you left your wife for had not, in fact, left her husband's memory for you. She thought about what that cost. She thought about it with more complexity than she would have allowed herself 6 months ago, because she had spent 6 months doing the hard work of seeing things clearly, and clarity did not permit her the comfort of simple contempt. He had been wrong. He had been badly wrong, in ways that had cost her the stability of the estate, cost her peace, Cost her a year of her life that she had spent rebuilding something he had let fall apart. She was not going to minimize that or forgive it too quickly, because forgiveness offered too quickly was not forgiveness. It was avoidance wearing forgiveness as clothing. But he was also, and this was the part she had not been ready to think until now, someone she had known for 7 years. Someone she had watched at his best and his worst, someone whose best was genuinely good, someone who was capable, she believed, of understanding what he had done. Not just regretting it, understanding it. The question was what she was going to do with that belief. She did not answer it that night. She went to bed at a reasonable hour, which was a thing she had learned to do, not to spend all night with questions that required more information than she currently had. She slept well. She had become good at sleeping. In the morning she went to the outbuilding, which the carpenters had begun renovating, and stood in the space that was going to be a school, and looked at the proportions of it, the way the light came in, the size of the room, how many children it could hold, and she felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with Frederick or Victoria or solicitors or debt guarantees. This was hers. This she had made from nothing but intention and persistence and the belief that it was the right thing to do. James Carpenter was working on the window frames. He looked up when she came in, nodded in the easy way he had developed with her, not deferential, not familiar, simply respectful, and went back to the frames. He had gotten very good, very fast. She had arranged for him to begin correspondence lessons with a tutor in the next county, something he had been too proud to request for himself and too intelligent to refuse when she offered it. Coming along, he said about the windows. It is, she agreed. She stayed for a while and watched the work and did not think about anything except the satisfying specificity of a good window frame and a room that was going to be used for something worthwhile. Then she went back to the manor and found a letter waiting. That changed everything again. It was not from Frederick. It was from his solicitor, his personal solicitor in London, the man who had managed Frederick's private affairs for 20 years, the man whose name had not appeared anywhere in the estate correspondence until now. The letter was addressed to her, which was the first surprise. The second surprise was the opening line, "Dear Mrs. Pembroke, I write to you at Mr. Pembroke's specific instruction, and with his full knowledge of the contents of this letter. He has asked me to provide you with a complete accounting of his personal financial position, separate from the estate accounts, so that you may have full information as you see fit. I have been asked to hold nothing back." She sat down. The accounting was 14 pages. She read all 14 pages. It took her 2 hours. She did not stop once briefly to ask Mrs. Webb for tea she then forgot to drink. The picture that emerged from 14 pages was not the picture of a man who had been conducting a secret life with effortless sophistication. It was the picture of a man who had made a series of decisions, each one following from the last with a kind of terrible logic, each one compounding the cost of the one before, who had arrived in France with money he thought he had, and a plan he thought was sound, and a woman he thought he understood, and had discovered, over 8 months, that all 3 assessments were wrong. The French investment had been Victoria's introduction, as she had known. What she had not known, what the 14 pages made clear, was the specific sequence. Victoria had brought Frederick into the investment in the early weeks of their time in France, when everything was still exciting and Frederick was still the man from the Pembroke estate with money to spend and a title that opened doors. Frederick had committed a significant sum. Victoria had encouraged this. The investment had begun to show problems within 6 weeks. By the time the problems were undeniable, Frederick had already been approached for additional capital to stabilize it, approached by the same investors, using the same social channels that Victoria had provided access to. And here was the part that caught in Sophia's throat. Frederick had refused the second request. He had refused it, according to a note attached to the solicitor's letter in Frederick's own handwriting, a note that was raw in a way his letters to her had never been, because by the time the second request came, he had started to understand that the entire enterprise had been structured to extract capital from wealthy English visitors with social ambitions, and that Victoria Ashford had known this from the beginning. He had been used, not deceived in the way of a man who trusted someone well and was betrayed unexpectedly. Deceived in the way of a man who was flattered into not looking closely at things he should have looked at closely, who allowed himself to believe what he wanted to believe, who mistook a transaction for affection. She understood that kind of deception. She had watched it from a different angle. She put the 14 pages down. She picked up the note in Frederick's handwriting, the raw one, the one that was too honest to be comfortable, and she read it again. I want Sophia to know all of this, not as explanation, not as excuse. She deserves to understand exactly what I did and exactly what it cost. I have been writing her letters for months that were honest in intent but careful in execution. I am tired of being careful. Tell her everything. She set the note down. She sat very still for a long time. Then she did something she had not done since the night before Frederick left. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, and she breathed hard, the way you breathe when something enormous is moving through you, and you are trying to let it move without being knocked over by it. It was not tears, or it was briefly, but not the kind she would have called crying. More the kind that comes from pressure releasing, from something that has been held in a contained space, finally having room to expand. She sat like that for perhaps 5 minutes. Then she straightened up, dried her face with the back of her hand, and pulled out paper. She wrote to the London solicitor first, acknowledging receipt of the accounting and requesting copies of 3 specific documents she needed for her own records. Businesslike, specific. Then she wrote to Frederick. This letter was not careful. She had decided, reading his note, that careful was finished. He had asked for honesty, and she was going to give it to him. All of it, the full weight and substance of what this year had been. She wrote for an hour and a half. She told him about the irrigation channel and the £200, and why she had chosen reroute over repair. She told him about the Hollis roof and Mary, who was a person now, 8 months old, who grabbed things and held on. She told him about James Carpenter and the correspondence lessons and the window frames for the school that was going to open by September. She told him about the calling notice on his debt guarantee and the 20 days she had had to respond, and how she had responded, and what it had cost and how she had managed it. She told him about the Ashford solicitor's harassment campaign and how she had ended it in one letter. She told him that she had been angry genuinely, deeply angry about the guarantee, about the secrecy, about the assumption that she would simply be here holding things together while he conducted a separate life, and its consequences would never reach her. She told him that she had built something in his absence that she was proud of. She told him that the estate was solvent and improving, and that the school would be the first of several things she intended to do with the position she found herself in, and that she intended to keep doing them. And then she told him what she had thought, reading his 14 pages. That she understood what had happened to him, not excused it, understood it. That she had seen the shape of Victoria Ashford's methods from the very beginning, from the first letter in violet ink on a silk handkerchief, and that watching it confirmed what she had already known, that Victoria had never been interested in him, only in what he represented, and that he had allowed himself not to see that, because being seen, being wanted, had felt necessary to Kim in a way she could not fully explain but recognized, because she had spent 7 years wanting to be seen by him in exactly the same way. She wrote, "I am not saying this to wound you. I am saying it because you asked for honesty, and this is honest. We were both, in our different ways, people who wanted to be seen and were not seeing each other clearly. That is the truth of what happened. Not the affair, not the money, those are consequences. That is the cause," she wrote. "I do not know what we are to each other now. I know that I am not the woman who stood in this library waiting for you to come home. I am not certain you are the man who left. I think we will have to meet the people we have become and see what is possible between them." She wrote, "Come home, Frederick, not because I am waiting, because there are things here worth coming home to, and some of them have your name on them, and I think you should see what has been done with your name." She signed it, Sophia, not your wife who waits, simply Sophia. She sealed the letter and sent it. Then she went to the outbuilding, because James Carpenter had finished 2 window frames and was starting the 3rd, and she wanted to see how it looked. The light came through the finished frames at an angle that was exactly right. She stood in the center of the room and looked at it, the space that was going to hold children, noise, learning, all the future uses of a room that had been wasted for 20 years, and she thought about what Frederick would see when he came home. Not what she would show him, what he would simply find because it would be there. A solved dispute, a restructured debt, a repaired roof, a boy learning to read accounts, a baby named Mary, a school with proper windows and light coming in at the right angle, a wife who had stopped waiting and had become something else entirely. She thought about his note, "I am tired of being careful," and she thought it might be the first entirely unguarded thing he had ever said to her, and she thought that 8 months ago she would not have known what to do with it, and that now she did, because she had spent 8 months becoming someone who could hold difficult truths without needing to simplify them. It was not forgiveness yet. She was too honest with herself to call it that. It was something more like readiness, the readiness of a woman who has done the work of understanding her own grief and her own anger and her own extraordinary capability, and who has arrived, on the other side of all that, at a place where the future feels genuinely open rather than closed, where what comes next is not determined by what came before, but by what both people decide to do with what they have learned. 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks, and a school to open, and an estate to finish bringing into order, and letters to write, and fields to check, and a baby named Mary who would be walking soon, and James Carpenter's 3rd window frame to approve. She realized, quite a full life. She went to look at the 3rd window frame, and the light through it was even better than the 2nd, and she told James so, and his expression, the particular expression of someone whose work has been seen and named correctly, was something she tucked away alongside Agnes Hollis's face at the farm gate, in the place where she kept things that mattered. 6 weeks. She was not counting. Frederick Pembroke came home on a Wednesday. Not the Wednesday he had named in his letter 3 days earlier, without announcement, without a second letter to warn her. The carriage came through the Pembroke gates at 2:30 in the afternoon, and Sophia was in the outbuilding that was now, as of 11 days prior, officially a school, reviewing the final supply list with the teacher she had hired, a woman named Miss Alderton, 26, sharp and capable, and exactly right when Mrs. Webb appeared in the doorway with the specific expression she wore when something required immediate attention. "The master's carriage," Webb said. "Just come through the gates." Sophia set down the supply list. She looked at Miss Alderton, who had the good sense to look at the window and say nothing. Then she straightened her jacket, which was slightly dusty from the morning's work, and walked out to meet her husband. She did not hurry. She had thought about this moment many times in the past 6 weeks. Had rehearsed it in the peripheral way you rehearse things. You cannot fully prepare for turning it over in quiet moments, considering what she would feel, what she would say, whether the woman she had become would be visible to him, or whether he would look for the woman he had left and find the absence of her confusing. She had prepared herself for several versions of this reunion. What she had not prepared for was the specific quality of the silence that fell when Frederick stepped down from the carriage and saw her coming across the yard. He looked older. Not dramatically, it had been less than a year, but there was something in the way he held himself that had changed. The ease was gone. Frederick had always moved through space with the unconscious authority of a man who has never seriously been challenged by it, and that quality, that particular, almost physical certainty was absent. What was there instead was something more careful, more deliberate, the posture of a man paying attention to where he puts his feet. He stopped when she was about 10 yards away. He did not come toward her, and she understood instinctively that this was not coldness. He was waiting for her to set the terms. He was giving her that. She stopped too. They looked at each other across 10 yards of open ground, and the distance felt both very large and very manageable, which she thought was probably honest. "You came early," she said. "I could not wait any longer." A pause, and something moved through his face, not quite emotion. Not yet. Something prior to emotion. Something like the moment before a dam moves. "I needed to see it. Everything you described. I needed to see if it was real." "It's real." He looked around at the manor, at the outbuilding with its new windows, at Thatcher, who had appeared from the direction of the stables, and was standing at a respectful distance, with the expression of a man watching something that has nothing to do with him, and everything to do with him simultaneously. Then Frederick looked back at her. "You're dusty," he said. "I've been at the school." Something crossed his face that she could not name. "Of course you have." She waited. He was working up to something. She could see it. The same way she had always been able to see it. 7 years of watching this man's face had given her a detailed map of how he approached difficult things. "I read your letter," he said finally. "The last one. I have read it many times. I know, you referenced it in your response." I did not respond adequately. He took 2 steps toward her, then stopped himself as though he had remembered something. "I responded to the parts I could answer. There were parts I couldn't answer yet." "Which parts?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, His voice had a quality she had heard exactly twice before in 7 years of marriage, once when his father died, once when he thought, briefly, that the estate's main crop had failed entirely in a storm, and the error had been discovered only hours later. The quality of a man who has reached the bottom of his own resources and is speaking from there. The part where you said we wanted to be seen and weren't seeing each other clearly. He held her gaze. I have been thinking about that since August. I don't know how to answer it except to say that you were right, and that I understand now what I was not seeing, and that understanding it now instead of then is. He stopped. It is not enough. I know it is not enough, but it is what I have. Sophia looked at him for a long moment. This was the part she had not been able to rehearse. Not his words, she had imagined many versions of what he might say, but the specific experience of standing in front of him and hearing something true come out of him directly, without scaffolding, without careful language, without the particular Frederick Pembroke construction that dressed every difficult thing in strategy. This was different. This was just him. Come inside, she said. There's a great deal I want to show you. She showed him the accounts first. Not as punishment, she had examined her own motives carefully enough to be certain of that, but because the accounts were the most honest record of what the year had actually been, and she wanted him to understand the year before he understood anything else. She spread the ledgers on the study desk the way Thatcher had once spread them for her, all those months ago, and she walked him through everything. The London debt restructuring, the terms she had negotiated, the timeline, what it had cost and what it had saved, the boundary arbitration and how she had won it, and what the specific legal argument had been. The irrigation channel reroute £200. She showed him the invoice, showed him the before and after yield projections from the East Fields, the tenant agreements, the new lease structures, the fact that 3 families who had been on the edge of leaving the estate had signed long-term renewals. Frederick stood next to her at the desk and looked at all of it without speaking. She watched him look at it. She watched the moment when he understood not just the individual items, but the cumulative shape of what they represented, the estate that had been crumbling, quietly, under the weight of his inattention, and the year of work it had taken to stop the crumbling and begin building something solid in its place. He put his hand flat on one of the ledger pages, not pointing at anything, just touching it. His voice was very quiet. That's debt, the guarantee I signed you. Manage that in 20 days? 19. He lifted his head. How? I found a legal question about the notice timing. Our solicitor confirmed it was genuine. It bought us time to negotiate restructured terms. She paused. I had been working on the estate's financial position for several months by then. We had room to maneuver that we would not have had in January. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, entirely undefended. Not admiring, that would have been too small for what was in his face. Something more like reckoning, the expression of someone counting the cost of a thing they failed to value. I owe you a great deal, he said. You owe the estate a great deal, she answered. I only did what needed doing. He held her gaze steadily. Do not diminish it, please, not for my comfort. She looked at him. He meant it. She could see that he meant it. All right, she said. You owe me a great deal. A beat of silence. Then, not a smile. Not quite, but the ghost of one, on both their faces, acknowledging the weight of it without collapsing under it. Thatcher appeared in the doorway with the careful timing of a man who has excellent instincts and a strong sense of appropriate distance. Mr. Pembroke, sir. Good to have you home. He did not add anything to that. He did not qualify it or soften it or make it into more than it was. Frederick turned to look at him. Something passed between them, not words, just the look of 2 people recalibrating around a new arrangement of things. Thatcher, a pause. I hear you've been invaluable. Mrs. Pembroke has been invaluable, Thatcher answered. I have been following her lead. He said it plainly, without performance. Frederick heard it the way it was intended, not as a rebuke, simply as the truth of what the year had been. I see, Frederick said quietly. The East Field crew is asking about the harvest schedule for next week, Thatcher added, looking at Sophia. When you have a moment. Tomorrow morning, Sophia said. 8 o'clock. Thatcher nodded and withdrew. Frederick watched him go with an expression that was working through several things at once. He addresses harvest schedules to you, Frederick said slowly. Not a question. He addresses estate matters to whoever is managing the estate, Sophia answered. That is how it should work. A long pause. Yes, Frederick said finally. It is. She took him to the school that afternoon. She had been uncertain whether to do this on his first day home. It felt, in some ways, too personal, too much of herself made visible too quickly, before they had found their footing with each other. But she had decided in the end that hiding it would be worse. The school was the most honest thing she had built here. If they were going to understand each other, he needed to see it. Miss Alderton had gone home for the day. The room was quiet, smelling of fresh wood and the chalk she had ordered from the county supplier last week. The 3 long tables were set up in rows, plates stacked neatly. The primers she had selected arranged on the shelf James Carpenter had built along the east wall, which caught the afternoon light exactly as she had intended. Frederick walked through it slowly. He stopped at the shelf of primers. He picked one up, turned it over, put it back carefully. "How many children?" he asked. 14 registered. "I expect more once the families see it is genuinely open and functioning." "Where did the funding come from?" "Estate reserves I identified and reallocated." She watched him carefully. "It does not affect the operating budget or the debt restructuring timeline." "I ran the numbers 3 times. He turned to look at her. "I am not questioning the funding, Sophia. I know. I am explaining it because I want you to understand it was not impulsive." "Nothing you have done this year was impulsive," he said. "A statement, not a compliment, just the recognition of a fact." "I know that." He walked to the window, the 3rd frame James had built, the one with the best light. He stood looking through it with his back to her. "I had a conversation in Paris," he said slowly, "after I received your letter, the long one. There is a man I met there, an English expatriate, been in France 20 years, older man, lost his estate back home through mismanagement, through inattention, through exactly the kind of choices I was making." A pause. "He told me something I have been thinking about since. He said the worst thing about losing something gradually is that you cannot name the exact moment it became unrecoverable. You look back and you see 100 small decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time, and you cannot find the single one you could have reversed." He turned from the window. "I can find mine," he said. "I know the exact moment. I know the exact room." She did not look away. "The library." He held her gaze. "I keep going back to it. To the way you stood there. You were not going to fall apart. I understood that within the first 30 seconds. That was the moment I should have." He stopped. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "I keep rewriting it, what I should have done." "You cannot rewrite it," she said gently. Not unkindly. "I know. You can only decide what you do from here." Something shifted in his face. She saw him take that in not as comfort, not as permission, but as the plain truth it was. The silence between them was not the silence of estrangement. It was the silence of 2 people who have a great deal to say and are being careful about the order. He came to the school the next morning. She had not invited him, and he had not asked. He simply appeared at 8:15, after she had finished with Thatcher and the harvest schedule, and stood in the doorway while she and Miss Alderton arranged the supply tables. He said nothing. He watched. He left before the first children arrived, but not before helping James Carpenter, who was making a last-minute adjustment to one of the table legs, hold the table steady while the adjustment was made. James glanced up at him. "Joins well," he said about the leg joint. "Good work." "I didn't do the work," Frederick said. James looked at the table. "But you held it." Something in that landed, and she saw it land on Frederick's face. He looked at the table for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded, once, and went out. That evening at dinner, the first dinner they had shared in almost a year, at the same long table where the farewell party had been held. Just the 2 of them, with no performance and no guests to maintain appearances, for he asked her about the Hollis family. She told him. He asked about the Eastfield drainage. She explained the engineering. He asked about the county arbitration, the specific legal argument, how she had known about the notice timing issue. She told him all of it. She watched him listen, really listen, not with the half attention she had sometimes received from him in the years when she had been the wife at the other end of the table, but with the focused, slightly humbled attention of someone learning something they should have known and are determined to learn properly now. After dinner, when Webb had cleared and left them with coffee and the fire, he said, "I want to understand something." She waited. The school, the tenant agreements, the arbitration, the channel reroute. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "None of this was you did not do this because you were trying to prove something to me." "No," she said. "I did it because it needed doing and I was the one here. But you could have done less. You could have maintained the status quo and waited for my return and handed it all back." "Yes, why didn't you?" She thought about the hilltop in May. the north field, looking out over everything. She thought about Agnes Hollis's face at the farm gate, and Mary grabbing her coat, and James Carpenter's third window frame, with the light coming through it exactly right. Because I discovered, she said slowly, that I was good at it. And I discovered that things that are worth doing don't wait for the right person to have permission. She looked at him directly. I have been waiting for permission my entire adult life, Frederick. I was waiting before I even knew that's what I was doing. And then you left, and there was no one to ask, and I had to decide what I was made of. He was very quiet. What you found out, he said, is that you were made of considerably more than either of us knew. Yes. The words sat between them, plain and honest and not gentle exactly, but not unkind either. I am sorry, he said. Not for the first time he had said it on the first day, in the study, standing over the ledgers. But this was different. This was not the apology of accounting, of acknowledging specific wrongs. This was something more fundamental. I am sorry that it took my absence for you to find out. I am sorry that I was so occupied with being seen as capable that I could not see how capable you were. I am sorry I told you to wait. She looked at him for a long time. I am not sorry for all of it, she said carefully. Not for what I found in the waiting, not for who I became. She paused. I am sorry it cost what it cost, the trust, the year. The grief of it, Frederick. It was grief. I want you to know that. It was not just anger. He flinched. She watched him take the word grief and feel the weight of it. I know, he said. I am sorry for the grief. The fire settled. The room was quiet, with the specific quiet of late evening, when everything that needed to be said has been said, and what remains is the question of what comes next. It was Frederick who broke the silence, and what he said was not what she expected. I want to help with the school. She looked at him. He chose his words carefully. Not to insert myself. Not to take it over. It is yours, and I understand that clearly. He met her gaze. But I would like to be useful to it, if you will tell me how. In whatever way is actually useful, not what I imagine is useful. She studied him, the man who had sat at the head of the farewell dinner table and told 20 guests a story that wasn't true, who had stood in the library afterward and asked her to wait for him as though it were a reasonable thing to ask. She studied the distance between that man and this one. It was real, the distance. She could see it. That did not mean it was sufficient. I will tell you how, she said, when I know. He nodded. He did not press. That, too, was new. Over the following weeks, Frederick moved through the estate with a quality of attention she had not seen from him before. He went out to the fields with Thatcher not to supervise, but to look, to understand. He asked questions she could see embarrassed him, questions about things he should have known and did not. Thatcher answered them without comment. The tenant families received him with a wariness he did not attempt to override, and he was wise enough to understand that the wariness was earned and that the only answer to it was patience. He came to the school twice a week. He fixed a door hinge that had been sticking. He carried a delivery of primers from the supply cart when they arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. He contributed, and without announcement, a sum of money to the school fund that covered the second year's operating costs. He told her about it, in a note left on the study desk, not in conversation, and the note said only, "This is not atonement. I know atonement is not a transaction. This is simply what I can do right now, and I am doing it." She left the note in the drawer with his letters. All of them. She kept all of them. The county noticed his changed manner the same way the county had noticed her transformation gradually. Then all at once, in the way things become visible when they reach a certain undeniable threshold. At the October parish meeting, Colonel Westbrook, who had approved the school proposal and been visibly startled by Sophia's competence, shook Frederick's hand and said, "Your wife has been extraordinary, Pembroke." Extraordinary. Frederick looked at Westbrook without the easy grace he would once have deployed, the smooth, confident deflection of a man who was accustomed to receiving such comments and redirecting them toward himself. He simply said, "I am aware of how much I missed." Westbrook stared at him. Then he gave a short nod, and it was not the nod of social agreement. It was the nod of a man acknowledging something he respects. She saw it happen. She was standing 12 feet away talking to Miss Alderton about the winter supply order. And she saw it, and she did not say anything, but she kept it. That night, walking back from the parish meeting in the November dark, they had begun walking together again, not because anything had been resolved, but because walking was easier than sitting face to face with everything that remained unsettled, and because she had discovered she could think more clearly when she was moving. Frederick said something in the middle of the road. I received a letter from Victoria. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The darkness around them was absolute and quiet, and the cold had come in off the fields, and she could hear her own heartbeat very clearly. What did it say? The question came out level, which surprised her. She asked whether I might put in a word with certain people in London for her. She is having difficulty with the Ashford estate solicitors regarding the property succession. A pause. She framed it as we had been close. She believed she could rely on my goodwill. She wanted a favor. Sophia wrote back, Frederick said. One sentence. I told her I had no goodwill to offer her and wished her well with her solicitors. She looked at him. He was watching her face. Why are you telling me? She asked. Because I told you I was done being careful, he said. Because you need to know. Because I will not have anything between us that you do not know about. He held her gaze. Not ever again. The cold air moved between them. She thought about the violet ink on the first letter, the silk handkerchief, the library. She thought about Mary, who was walking now, had taken her first steps last week, had grabbed a chair and let go of it, and crossed 3 feet of floor entirely on her own, and Agnes had wept. And Sophia had stood in that kitchen and felt something move in her chest that had no practical name. She thought about the school with its good windows, and the light coming in at exactly the right angle. She thought about Frederick, in Paris, alone in whatever room he had written those letters from, practicing being simply sorry. She thought about the woman she was now versus the woman who had stood in the library with perfectly steady hands, holding a letter folded into a precise square, deciding what kind of woman she was going to be. All right, she said quietly. Thank you for telling me. They stood in the November dark for another moment. Then she began walking again, and he walked beside her, and neither of them spoke for the rest of the way home. But the silence had a different quality than the silences of the first weeks, less the silence of things unresolved, and more the silence of two people who have said the hard things and are now simply walking forward in the same direction, through the same dark. She did not take his arm. She was not ready for that yet. But she did not move away from him either, and the distance between them as they walked was not estrangement. It was something more honest than estrangement. It was the distance between two people who are learning, very carefully, what trust actually requires when it has to be built a second time, not assumed, not performed, but built stone by stone, in the full knowledge of how much weight it has to hold. The manor lights were visible ahead, through the dark. Her school was behind them, windows dark, waiting for Tuesday. The Eastfields had come in strong, just as Thatcher had projected. The Hollis baby was walking. James Carpenter's accounts were accurate to the last shilling. The life she had built was intact, hers, and walking beside her through the cold November dark was a man who had gone away, someone she thought she knew, and come back, someone she was only beginning to understand. And the question of what they were to each other now was real and open and unresolved. And she found to her own considerable surprise that she could hold that question without needing to answer it tonight. She had learned in all of this that some things cannot be rushed. She had also learned that some things, given the right conditions and enough honest attention, do eventually come clear. She was willing to wait for that kind of waiting, the kind that was building towards something rather than holding still for someone else. That was a different thing entirely. Winter came to Pembroke that year, with the particular thoroughness of a season that intends to be taken seriously. The school closed for December and January. Miss Alderton had family in the north, and the tenant roads became unreliable in hard frost. But Sophia used the closure to plan the spring term, which she intended to expand. 4 more children had registered in November, 3 of them from farms she had not yet visited, which told her that word was traveling in the way good things travel, not through announcement but through conversation between people who trust each other. The primers needed replenishing. She wanted to add a second afternoon session for the older children, who were moving faster than she had projected. She was at the desk working on the spring curriculum when Frederick knocked on the study door in the second week of December. Knocked, which was not something he would have done a year ago, would not have thought necessary in his own house, and came in with 2 cups of tea and set one in front of her without asking whether she wanted it. She did want it. She had been at the desk since 7. He sat down in the chair across from her, the one Thatcher used for estate meetings, and looked at the papers spread across the desk, with the attention he had been bringing to things lately, the focused, unhurried attention of someone who has decided to actually see what is in front of him. Second session, he said, reading her notes upside down. For the older students. They're ready for more, she answered. Miss Alderton agrees. The Pearson boy reads better than children twice his age. He was simply never given material at his level. A pause. Then what does he need? She looked up. The Pearson boy, Frederick repeated. What does he need to keep advancing, specifically? She studied him for a moment. This was something he had been doing, asking specific questions about the school's students, about the tenants, about the people whose lives intersected with the estate, not in the broad managerial way of a landowner who wants a summary, but in the particular way of someone who has decided that particulars matter. She was still calibrating how to respond to it. Some part of her remained alert for the performance of changed behavior, the kind of effort that sustains itself only as long as it is being observed and then quietly lapses. She had not seen it lapse, not once in 3 months. He needs access to a proper lending library, she said. The primers are below him already, and he needs someone to talk to about what he reads, not to be taught at, but to have actual conversation with. He's 9 years old, and he's running out of intellectual equals in the village. Frederick was quiet for a moment. I have approximately 400 books I have not looked at in 2 years, he said carefully. Could the lending library be here, with appropriate and a system, so that nothing is damaged? She looked at him. It is a practical suggestion, he added. Nada, I am not trying to make it mine. The school is yours. I just have books that are not being used and a boy who needs them. She thought about the Pearson boy, dark-haired, serious. The way some children are serious, as though they were born knowing that the world contained more than what they could currently access, and they intended to close that gap. She thought about what access to Frederick's library would mean to that child. I will speak with Miss Alderton, she said. If she agrees on the logistics, yes. Something in Frederick's face relaxed, not with triumph, not with the satisfaction of a man who has gotten what he wanted, but with the simpler relief of someone who has offered something and had it received. Thank you, he said. They drank their tea in the quiet of the December morning, papers between them, and it was not the comfortable silence of people who have nothing left to say to each other. It was something harder won than that, something they were both working at, every day, choosing into. She thought she could see the difference between those two kinds of silence. Now, she was becoming good at seeing the difference between things that looked similar and were not. The letter arrived on a Monday in mid-January, and it was addressed to both of them. This was unusual enough that Mrs. Webb brought it in personally, rather than leaving it in the Morning Post. The handwriting was unfamiliar, formal, precise, with the specific quality of legal penmanship. The seal was from a London firm. Sophia opened it while Frederick was in the Eastfield meeting with Thatcher about spring planting. The letter was from the London solicitor of one Lord Harrington, a peer of considerable standing whose estate in Derbyshire was, the letter explained, undergoing a period of significant financial restructuring. Lord Harrington had heard through channels the letter did not specify, but which Sophia could reconstruct easily enough from the web of county connections she had been navigating for a year of the work done at Pembroke Estate. The boundary arbitration, specifically, the debt restructuring, the manner in which certain challenges had been resolved with speed and effectiveness that had attracted, the letter said diplomatically, professional notice. Lord Harrington was writing to ask whether Mrs. Pembroke would be willing to consult on his estate's restructuring. He was prepared to pay a professional fee. She read the letter 3 times. Then she set it very carefully on the desk and sat with it for a long time. A professional fee, for her judgment, for what she had learned and done. Not as a favor, not as a social courtesy, but as work recognized, valued, compensated as work. She was still sitting with it when she heard Frederick's boots in the hallway. He came in from the field with cold on his coat, and color in his face. He had been out since 8, which was also new. The early mornings in the fields with Thatcher, the physical presence in the work he had previously managed only from the study desk. He saw her expression before he saw the letter. What is it? She held it out without speaking. He read it standing. She watched his face. She was watching for something specific, the particular reflex of a man who hears that his wife has been recognized professionally and feels, somewhere in the complicated territory of pride and ego, a pull toward diminishing it, toward finding the reason it is less significant than it appears. She did not see it. What she saw was more interesting. She saw him read it through once quickly, then again slowly. and then look up with an expression she could only something between wonder and a kind of pain that was not quite grief, more like the feeling of arriving somewhere too late and recognizing it clearly. "They want to pay you," he said. "Yes, for the kind of work you've been doing here for a year." A pause. "For nothing." "For the estate," she corrected. "Not for nothing." "You know what I mean." She did. And she let the acknowledgement stand because it was true and because she had stopped protecting him from true things. "Will you do it?" he asked. "I don't know yet." She took the letter back. "I wanted you to know about it." There was a weight in that sentence that they both felt. She had wanted him to know. She had chosen to tell him immediately, to put it between them, instead of making the decision alone and presenting it after the fact. It was a choice she was making consciously. A choice about what kind of partnership she was willing to attempt building here, not the old kind, where she managed in silence and he presided without looking, but something different. Something that required both of them to be present and honest and willing to be known. "Sophia," he set the letter on the desk between them. "Whatever you decide, I want you to know that this does not surprise me. It should have happened years ago. It should have been possible years ago." He stopped. "I am sorry it took a year of crisis and absence for the world to see what was already there." She looked at him for a long time. "I am going to write to Lord Harrington," she said finally. "I want to understand the specifics of the situation before I decide." He nodded. He did not add anything. He understood that this was not a discussion, it was an announcement of her intentions, and she was making it out of courtesy and the beginning of trust, not because she needed his agreement. He understood that. She could see that he understood it. That understanding, she thought, was worth more than she could have calculated. She wrote to Lord Harrington the next morning, requesting the specifics. His response arrived within the week, thorough, detailed, honest, about the difficulties in a way that told her he was not looking for someone to perform confidence, but someone to actually solve problems. She spent 2 evenings reading through it carefully, making notes, running preliminary figures in her head. On the 3rd evening, she told Frederick she had decided to take the consultation. "One visit to Derbyshire," she said, "to assess the situation in person. Then I will know whether I can help and what the scope would be. When the roads are better. Thatcher can manage the estate for a week. He has been managing it capably for months." Frederick was quiet for a moment. "Then may I come with you?" She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I have not been to Derbyshire in 5 years, and because he stopped and chose the honest version. Because I would like to be useful on this trip in whatever way I actually can be useful, and I would like you to see me trying to be useful at something that is yours." A pause. "And because I do not want you to be traveling that distance alone in March." She sat with the request. She turned it over, looking at it from different angles, the way she examined everything, now not accepting it at face value, not rejecting it reflexively, but actually looking at it. "You would follow my lead," she said, "in all professional matters. Lord Harrington has engaged me, not us, completely. And if I ask you to wait in the carriage, you wait in the carriage." Something crossed his face, a flicker of something. Not quite amusement. Not quite something heavier than amusement. "I have some experience," he said quietly, "with being asked to wait." The sentence landed between them, with all the weight of everything it contained. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said, "you do." The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was honest, which was different. It was the kind of silence in which two people acknowledged together the full dimensions of something that happened, without softening it and without weaponizing it. Just holding it together, both of them, because that was what truth required. "You may come to Derbyshire," she said. February brought an unexpected crisis that tested everything they had built in the quiet months. A fire in the south barn, no lives lost, but the building was destroyed, and with it the stored feed for the winter livestock, which was a material loss in February with 6 weeks of winter remaining. Sophia was at the site within 20 minutes of the alarm. Thatcher beside her, the two of them assessing damage and calculating need before the embers were fully cold. Frederick arrived 4 minutes after she did, having come straight from the north field on horseback. He did not ask what had happened. He took one look at her face, at Thatcher's careful notes, at the situation, and said, "What do you need?" Not what happened, not who is responsible, not the question of a man asserting authority over a crisis. The question of someone who has assessed where the help needs to go and is ready to provide it. "We need feed sourced from 3 different suppliers by the end of the week," she said. "Our regular supplier cannot cover the full shortfall. I need the contracts negotiated quickly. Cost is secondary to speed and reliability right now, but do not let them exploit the urgency more than 30% above market rate. He left for the village within the hour to begin the negotiations in person. She stayed at the site, managing the immediate response, the livestock, the safety assessment, the question of whether the barn could be partially rebuilt before the end of winter, or whether they needed an interim structure. He came back that evening with supply commitments from 2 of the 3 required vendors and a third possibility he had located, through a contact he had not used in years, a trading relationship he had maintained in London that turned out, in this moment, to be exactly the right thing to have. She looked at the commitments. The terms were good. Better than good. How did you get this price from Harrison's? I have done business with them for 12 years, he answered. And I told them the situation plainly and asked them to be decent about it. A slight pause. They were. She looked at the paperwork. This is good work, Frederick. He did not deflect it. He did not fold it into something larger or dismiss it with modesty. He simply said, thank you, and meant it. And she understood that he had learned in France, in the long months since, in the slow rebuilding of everything, that accepting acknowledgement gracefully was not the same as needing it. That was the night something shifted in her. Not broke, nothing broke. Nothing had been held so rigid that a shift required breakage. But something moved, like a river finding a new channel that had always been there, that the drought had simply kept hidden. She did not say anything about it that night. She went to bed at a reasonable hour, lay in the dark, and let herself understand what she was feeling. What she was feeling was this: she trusted him. Not completely. Not without the memory of what had preceded this trust. Not in the way she had trusted him before, the uncritical, unexamined trust of a woman who had not yet been given reason to look closely. This was different. This was trust that had passed through fire and come out the other side, knowing exactly what it was made of. She trusted him the way you trust a bridge that has been tested. Not because it has never failed, because you have watched it hold. March came, and with it the Derbyshire trip, which was everything she had planned and considerably more effective than she had projected. Lord Harrington was a man in his mid-60s who had managed a large estate for 40 years, with the assumption that certain kinds of knowledge were self-evident, and had discovered, in the financial upheavals of the past decade, that they were not. He was not too proud to admit this. That alone made him worth helping. She spent 3 days at his estate, reviewing accounts, meeting with his land steward, walking the tenant farms, asking the same questions she had taught herself to ask at Pembroke, not the questions of a supervisor, but the questions of someone who needs to actually understand a situation before proposing anything about it. Lord Harrington followed her through all of it, with the focused attention of a man who has decided he is going to learn something. Frederick, true to his word, followed her lead. He spent the first day talking with the estate's head groom, who turned out to know more about the practical condition of the outlying properties than anyone in the main house did. He brought her what he learned without presenting it as his own analysis, just, here is what I found, use it as you see fit. He attended one meeting at her invitation and contributed once a single specific observation about a financial instrument Lord Harrington was considering, and then sat back and said nothing more because it was not his meeting to run. On the last evening, Lord Harrington looked across his dinner table at both of them and said, I have been doing this for 40 years, and I have never once thought to consult my wife on estate matters. I am now wondering whether that was one of the more expensive assumptions I have ever made. Frederick, without looking at Sophia, said it was, in my experience, extraordinarily expensive. In every sense of the word. Lord Harrington looked at him, then at Sophia, then back to him. You speak from personal knowledge. I do. A silence. Then Lord Harrington picked up his wineglass. Well, here is to arriving at wisdom. Even if the tuition is higher than one would have chosen. Sophia lifted her glass. She did not look at Frederick, but she felt him beside her, the specific quality of his presence, the weight and warmth of it, and she allowed herself to feel it without immediately examining it to death. The drive back to Pembroke took 2 days. On the second day, somewhere in the middle of a long, quiet stretch of road, Frederick said, without preamble, what are you thinking? She had been watching the fields. Spring was beginning, not fully, not the open declaration of it, but the first suggestions, the loosening of the ground, the quality of light changing toward something warmer. I am thinking about the Harrington estate, she answered. There is a tenant situation in the Eastern Quarter that is more urgent than he has registered. I want to send a letter this week. What else? She glanced at him. He was watching the road ahead. I am thinking about Pembroke, she said carefully. About the spring curriculum. About whether James is ready to begin working directly with the London solicitor on estate contracts. I think he is nearly there. What else? She was quiet, Sophia. He turned to look at her. I am asking because I would like to know what you are actually thinking. Not the business, what you are thinking. She held his gaze for a long moment. Outside, the fields moved past. I am thinking, she said slowly, that I did not expect to trust you again. I thought what was broken finally and completely. I thought the library was the last room we would ever share that honestly. She paused. I am thinking that I was wrong about that, and I am trying to decide what to do with being wrong. He was very still. I am not asking you to decide quickly, he said. I am not asking you to decide at all on any schedule but your own. I know, only he stopped, started again. I am only asking you to let me keep trying, not because I believe effort alone is enough. I know it is not, but because the alternative. He looked out at the passing fields. The alternative is to stop trying, and I find that I cannot. I find that this. He gestured slightly at the space between them. Whatever this is, whatever we are building, I cannot imagine choosing to stop. She looked at him for a long time. The carriage moved through the early spring light, and she looked at the man beside her, not the man she had married, not the man who had left, but the man who had come back changed and had stayed changed, who had held the table steady and sourced the feed and waited in Derbyshire and asked the questions that were hard to ask, and she made a decision. Not about forever, not about the full architecture of what they might be. Those were still questions she needed time with, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But about now. About this carriage, this road, this man beside her in the early spring light. She reached across and put her hand over his. He went very still. He did not move, did not grab her hand, did not turn it into something larger than it was. He simply received it. The way you receive something precious, with great care, with the understanding that it can be withdrawn and that you must not for one moment forget it. They rode the rest of the way to Pembroke in silence, her hand over his, and neither of them spoke about it. And when they arrived home, as the afternoon light was failing, and the manor came into view through the gates, the only thing she said was the spring curriculum. I want your thoughts on the library system for the Pearson boy, when you have a moment. Tonight, he said immediately. After dinner. Tonight then. She stepped out of the carriage and walked toward the manor, and she did not look back, but she heard him behind her, his step on the gravel, following her in, and she thought, this is what it looks like. Not the grand gesture, not the single moment of redemption neatly packaged. This is what it actually looks like. A hand over his in a carriage. A library for a boy who deserves better books. Dinner and a conversation that is real. A year went by, and then another. The school expanded. The second session opened in the spring as planned, and by autumn there were 31 children registered, and Sophia was in correspondence with 2 other landowners in adjacent counties who were considering similar programs and wanted her advice. Lord Harrington's estate restructuring concluded successfully in the summer, and the letter he sent afterward was 3 pages long and concluded, "The Pembroke name has meant something in this county for generations. I believe it will continue to mean something. But I also believe, Mrs. Pembroke, that what it means going forward will have a great deal to do with you." She showed Frederick the letter. He read it, folded it, handed it back. "He is right," he said simply. James Carpenter, who was 19 now and had been taking correspondence for 2 years, was formally appointed to the estate's accounts management under Thatcher's supervision. At his first official meeting with Sophia and Frederick together, he came in with a leather satchel that looked as though he had saved up for it carefully and laid out his first independent audit of the quarterly accounts with the focused seriousness of someone who has waited a long time for permission to be as capable as he actually is. When he finished, Sophia looked at his work and then looked at him. "This is excellent, James." He tried not to look too pleased. He was not entirely successful. "The East Field projections are a bit conservative," he said, "but I'd rather be conservative and be right than bold and be wrong." "That," Frederick said, from his chair on the other side of the desk, "is the single most valuable piece of financial wisdom I have learned in 20 years. I wish someone had told me that at 19. James looked at him with the frank assessment of a young man who does not yet know how to disguise what he thinks. "Maybe someone did," he said, "and it didn't take." A silence. Then Sophia put her pen down and pressed her lips together. Because she would not laugh, she absolutely would not laugh. Frederick looked at James Carpenter for a long moment. Then he said, "You may be right about that." Mary Hollis walked into the school, for the first time in September of that year, at age 2.5, which was early by any standard. But Agnes had asked, and Sophia had said yes immediately, because Mary had her mother's practicality and her own particular determination, and Miss Alderton had said there was no reason to wait for a child who was already ready. Mary sat in the front row with her hands folded on the table and looked at the primer like it was something she intended to conquer. Sophia stood in the doorway of the school, watching this, and Frederick came up behind her. He had taken to walking out to the school with her on Tuesday mornings, not to enter, simply to walk, and stood beside her in the doorway. "Agnes must be proud," he said quietly. "Agnes is terrified Mary will outread her within the year," Sophia answered. "She is probably right." A pause. The morning was clear and cool, the light through the windows falling exactly as she had intended it to fall when she stood in this empty room 2 years ago and decided what it was going to be. "Do you remember," Frederick said, "when I told you to wait for me?" She went still. He was not looking at her. He was looking at Mary in the front row, at the primer, at the morning light through the windows James had built. "I remember," she said. "I have been thinking about those 4 words for 2 years," he said. "What I meant by them. What I was actually asking." A pause. "I think I was asking you to remain exactly as I had left you. As though you were something I could set down and pick back up unchanged. As though your life was a room I could walk in and out of on my own schedule." He turned to look at her. "I did not understand," he said, "that you were not waiting for me at all. You were waiting for yourself. You were waiting for the chance to become someone. And it happened to coincide with my absence, which is something I will carry for the rest of my life. That I was in the way, that my presence was the obstacle." She looked at him for a long time. "You were not entirely the obstacle," she said carefully. "I was, too. I had stopped asking for room. I had decided that asking was futile, and so I had simply gotten smaller. Made myself fit the space I was given." She paused. "That was my part of it. I am not giving it back to you." He held her gaze. "Sophia, we were both," she said, failing to see each other. "That is what I wrote to you. I meant it. I know you meant it. A beat. That is what I have been trying to become worthy of. Not the forgiveness I know. Forgiveness is not a transaction. Just worthy of being seen by you clearly and having what you see be something other than a cautionary tale." Mary Hollis in the front row had opened her primer to the first page and was studying it with the focused intensity of someone taking an inventory. Sophia looked at her husband. The man who had come back from France, changed in the ways that counted, who had held the table and sourced the feed and sat in the carriage and received her hand over his without grasping at it. The man who had asked about the Pearson boys' books and sourced them from his own library and never once presented this as something he was owed credit for. The man who had been wrong had understood he was wrong and had spent 2 years doing the work of being different without ever once asking her to call the work done before she was ready. "I see you clearly," she said. "That is why I am standing here." He was quiet for a long moment. "Then I am grateful," he said, simply, without decoration, "for what you are willing to see." She looked back at the school, at Mary with her primer, at the shelves James had built, at the morning light through the windows, at everything she had made from what could have been only wreckage. She thought about the woman in the library, holding a letter folded into a precise square, hands perfectly steady, deciding. She thought about the hilltop in May, looking out over the estate, thinking, "I am not waiting anymore." She thought about all of it, the ledgers and the drainage maps and the arbitration and the school and James's leather satchel and Mary's first steps and Lord Harrington's 3-page letter and a hand over his in a carriage in the early spring light. She thought about what waiting had become, in the end. Not the waiting he had asked her for, that waiting she had refused. And it had been the right refusal, the refusal that had made everything else possible. But the other kind, the waiting she had described to him in that long, honest letter. The waiting for herself to become someone she expected. That waiting had been worth every day of it. And the woman it had made her capable, undiminished, clear-eyed, wholly her own, had looked at the man beside her and made a choice. Not out of habit, not out of fear, not out of the settled inertia of a marriage that had never been tested. Out of the knowledge of exactly who she was and exactly what she was choosing and exactly why. That was not the same as the woman who had waited in the library. That woman had not chosen Frederick. She had simply not yet found a reason to leave. This woman was choosing, every day, fully awake, with everything she knew, and everything she had built, and everything she had become. That was the difference. That was everything. She took one last look at Mary in the front row, at the light through the windows, at all of it. Then she straightened her jacket, the way she always did when she was ready to begin, and she walked away from the doorway and back into the morning. And Pembroke, the estate, the school, the fields, the people, the whole living weight of everything she had made it, breathed steadily around her, the way a place breathes when it is truly, finally, well cared for. She did not look back. She had learned, a long time ago, in the very best way, that the woman she was going did not need to.